This unit is the foundations unit of government, and this objective is the different types and forms of government that we're going to be looking at. So this is one objective that there's no easy way to get around it. You're just going to have to put the memory muscle into it. But it's really hard to talk about government and compare things in our government if you are not familiar with the different types and forms of government. So these are some terms you just plain need to know. One of the things I want to remind you about is how we form words and put words together. Whenever you see a suffix of a word with archy, A-R-C-H-Y, or cracy, C-R-A-C-Y, that means to rule. Prefix of the words like demo, which means all people, put that with democracy, that means all people rule. So when you put prefixes with suffixes and form that language, that helps you understand a little bit better about the terms that we use for different types of government. But these are the terms you're going to have to do. And see, my dog's really excited about it as well. So hopefully Bella calms down about her excitement about types and forms of government. Okay, so I do want to make sure we understand the classification system for types and forms of government. And so when we classify these different terms, there's the participatory aspect. In other words, the number, how many can participate in governmental power? Are we talking about autocracies, oligarchies, democracies? That's what the participation part is about. Another classification we have is the geographical area of how that power is distributed geographically. Is it one central power and that same rule goes out to everybody? Is it split by regions? Are those regions autonomous or are they subject to a stronger national power? And so that geographical classification is there as well. And then if there is a division between the legislative and executive branch, who holds that power? Is it a working partnership or is it separate and equal? And that's the legislative versus executive classification. Not every government, not those 200 countries in the world, those 200 states, not all of them will have a legislative versus executive classification because some of them are kings and dictators. Their participation is an autocracy classification, so there would not be a legislative and executive branch. So let's look at the aspect of participation, and I want to look at the category of democracy. Now, demo means all people rule, and there's different kinds of democracies. But the idea is that the political authority rests with the people. The supreme and ultimate power, the sovereign power, rests for the people. And I think sometimes we forget in our country, it's we the people. It's we the people who are giving their consent, but it's we the people who are making that happen. And so that political power in our Constitution, we the people, is very purposeful in starting that way because that power is with the people. So that political power rests with the people, and the government can only do what it needs to do if the people give their consent to do so. So that is that democracy participation. I love this picture because look at these people lined up to vote. Fantastic, right? I just love democracy and people understanding that they have a civic duty to vote. Direct democracy is not really practiced in the world because it's pretty well impossible to do in a country of our size. Pure democracy means every single person votes on every single issue. And every single person goes to a mass meeting and you vote. Well, that's impossible because there are thousands of laws introduced every year on the national, state, and local levels. We would spend all our time trying to vote and trying to understand what the issues are. And so we don't do that. Now, there are isolated places in the world where they do have democracy that's direct. Usually those are towns or small little areas where it could work because there's no way you can bring 325 million people to a town meeting in the United States. So it only really works for those small communities, those small towns, that direct democracy. We have what we call an indirect democracy. And an indirect democracy is another term for that is a representative democracy. In other words, we vote, everybody votes for a person to represent them in their voting. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to vote 100% of the time the way you want them to vote. That's not what that means. But because we can't have a direct democracy, we have gone with a indirect democracy, a representative democracy. And most nations that practice democracy have a representative democracy. Now, another term for representative democracy is a republic. And if you think about our Pledge of Allegiance, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands. That is our representative democracy. So we are, another term for indirect democracy is representative democracy, and another term for representative democracy is a republic. Those all mean the same thing. Now, there's other terms for democracy as well, but I'm not going to go into that. I'll take the caveat to that at the end. Now, there's also participation by one, uno. That's our dictator, which is this one person has absolute power and authority over everybody. It is unchallengeable unless you can remove them from their position. And the ruler doesn't have to be responsible to the will of the people. They can do exact opposite of what the people want and the masses want. That's a dictatorship. They don't have to respect your rights because they are absolute powerful and they can do what they want. Now, most of them, to keep their position, will incorporate what the people want. Otherwise, the people will probably revolt. Doesn't always mean that's the case. Look at what's going on in North Korea, Venezuela. Now, with that dictatorship, that falls under the term what we call autocracy. Remember, cracy means to rule. Auto means one person rules. Now, there's a few different types of autocracies, but a dictatorship is a type of autocracy where one person holds power. Ali means small group. Archy, again, means to rule. So this means a small group of people rule. And usually these are self-appointed elite. In Afghanistan, it was the religious elite rulers, the Taliban. Sometimes it's the wealthiest rule. Sometimes it's the property owners, only a few people who hold the property. But it's a small group that rules. Some people put oligarchy as a form of dictatorship, but usually we consider dictatorship one person rule. But the idea is there's absolute power and control there. So a monarchy would fall under an autocracy. So when we look at categories of numbers, we have autocracy, which means one, oligarchy, which means small group, and demo, which means all people. Now, when it comes to types of government, there's well over 200 types of government. And I don't think we want to look at all 200 types and memorize them. It's more important that you understand the categorization and some of these key terms and concepts and how those go together. Now, there's also forms of government. So think of this as a geographical form distribution of power. Thankfully, there's only 3 geographical forms of distribution. So one of those is the unitary, and just like unitary sounds, unit means one, unitary government, which means there's one centralized government. Obviously, the United States doesn't have that. If that was the case, we would just have Washington, D.C., and there'd be no states, and everything would be the same throughout all 50 states, which isn't the case for us. And so all powers in that unit system are held by one central agency that controls everything. And sometimes they create local units, but those local units have to do what the main central national unit says to do. And so if you look at the speed limits across the United States, you know that's not the United States, because if we had a unitary system, speed limits would be the same throughout all of the United States. Driver's licenses. Some people can't get their driver's license in states until they're 18. Some people have school permits at 14, like we do here in Iowa. So if it was a unitary system, it would be the same throughout the entire United States, and that's not the way the United States is, so that's not what we have. We have a federal system, and yes, you've heard me say we created this, but federalism is this division of powers between central government and local governments. A confederation has those division of powers. The difference is, in a confederation, the regional powers are supreme, and in a federal system, the national power is supreme. And that's the same thing in our Constitution. The supreme law of the land is the United States Constitution, and the states are subject to the supreme law of the land, even though there's regional powers within those states, which is our federalism. where some powers are just for the states, some powers are just for the national system, and some powers are concurrently shared by both. The other thing you need to think about is when it comes to a federal government, those states as well as the national government have to agree to make changes. And that's in our Constitution as well. When we want to change that power distribution, that would have to be an amendment to the Constitution. And we'll be looking at those amendments to do that. And the states would have to agree to do that. Okay, so confederation, that is an alliance of independent states. And so we've had a confederation twice in our country. We had the Articles of Confederation after we won the Revolutionary War, before we wrote the Constitution for the United States of America, and that was ratified in 1789. And then during the Civil War, there was the Confederate States of America. And those Confederate States of America, those were independent states, those southern states, each one was supreme and sovereign. So the other states couldn't tell that state what to do. But they came together for purposes like, in that case, war or trade purposes for a confederation. So if you look at the graphic on the right, the local states, the local is supreme, and the central system does not have the sovereign ultimate power in a confederation. There are no confederations in the world today. The reason why is they are too unstable. It just doesn't work. So they usually are very short-lived, and because those local organizations have their own sovereignty, it's difficult to keep them together over time. So they do not exist. Next, the third category, and remember, not every country will have this. Every country has a type and form of government. The form is the geographical distribution of power. The type is the number, the administrative, the number. If there is not a legislative and executive branch, you can't have this classification of government. So a presidential government means what the United States has, the executive branch and the legislative branch is separate. The executive is elected separately from Congress members in our presidential type of executive government. So the president is chosen in their own election. They're not picked from the legislative branch, nor does the legislative branch pick them. And the president has a fixed term of office, and the president has their own executive powers that the legislative branch cannot control. That is a presidential government. A parliamentary government, and that is the door to Great Britain's parliamentary head, 10 Downing Street. Parliamentary, the prime minister is chosen and the cabinet is chosen via the legislative branch. The prime minister is actually a member of the legislative branch. Now, the reason that's positive is because if your president is chosen from the legislative branch, there's not going to be really any disagreement because the majority of the legislators agree with the president they put there. In our system, our executive system, since they're separate, you might have a Republican president and a Democrat Congress. Then you get conflict. Okay, but that's part of the checks and balances, and that's what we believe in our system is a better form of distributing power. So the difference here with parliamentary is since the prime minister or the leader, the executive, is from the legislative branch, there really isn't an additional check to make sure people's rights are being protected. And so that direct control from the executive is influenced by the parliament. And in order for the executive to keep their power in this system, they have to do what the legislative branch wants them to do. So those are the classifications for types and forms of government. Make sure you review and study those different types and forms. Don't forget anarchy, no government, considered usually very chaos, and rights are definitely not protected in an anarchy. So make sure you review those types and forms of governments and the classification systems. Those will be on your test. Make sure you have your notes completed.